Hi everyone, Alex here from Hack to the Basics, and today we are going to be looking at the first video tutorial in a series of tutorials of web application hacking. And today we'll be looking at what is HTTP, which is the Hypertext Transfer Protocol, which is the most commonly used web protocol. HTTP stands for Hypertext Transfer Protocol and is the most commonly used web protocol. You may recognize it in the prefix from when you're typing in a URL. So this is actually the protocol that goes before your URL to basically tell the web server what protocol you're using. So firstly, we'll take a look at what hypertext is. So the internet is made up of links, so data that links from one page to another. These links are known as hypertext. So HTTP is actually working by sending hypertext, hence the name Hypertext Transfer Protocol. So HTTP allows for the transfer of hypertext between a client and a web server. A client is whatever you're using to access the website, so it could be a browser on your phone, it could be a browser on your computer, it could be a mobile application, it could even be a thick client, so a desktop application. The way that this works is that the client is sending a URL to the web server. On this web server, it has web software installed that's designed to handle HTTP requests. Common web softwares are sort of Nginx, Apache, Microsoft IIS. There are plenty of them. And this web software processes the request, sends a response back to the client, and the client then renders the response so you are able to view it. HTTP is completely stateless. This is a really important thing to understand, that HTTP requests are completely independent of each other. Similar to flipping a coin, the outcome of a coin flip is not dependent on the previous coin flip in any way. HTTP works in the same way. There are stateful technologies that can be implemented alongside HTTP, such as sessions with session cookies, but HTTP is completely independent of this, which is really important to note. HTTP uses methods to request actions from the server. So we'll start off by taking a look at what HTTP requests are. So HTTP requests are used to send and request data from the server. HTTP uses methods or actions, or some people even call them verbs, to communicate with the server. Here is the anatomy of a basic HTTP request. We've got the method, the resource, the HTTP version, the host, the user agent, content type, and headers. Here is what an actual HTTP request looks like. So as we said before, we've got the method here, so we're using the get method. We've got our resource, we'll get into a bit more detail about what that actually is a bit later in this talk. We've got our HTTP version, we've got our user agent, and we've got our headers. So firstly, we're going to take a look at methods and the different methods that are available in the HTTP protocol. We're not going to go into all of the methods today because it would take a long time, but it is worth noting that there are more than we're talking about, but we will look at the most commonly used ones. So get and post are the most commonly used HTTP verbs. Put, delete, options, trace, and patch are relatively common as well. The get method. The get method is used to request data from a web server. It sends all of the request data inside the URL, which means that it's incredibly insecure. So if you're trying to log into a web application, you do not want to be using the get request or the get method to do so. Your username and your password would show up in the URL, similar to the screenshot that we can see below. This is not good, and get requests are saved in browser history, which means that if you're using a shared computing environment like a library and you log in via a get request, if someone goes and looks at the history, they'll be able to see your credentials in there. Get requests are also logged on the server side, so if anyone compromises the application's underlying server, they'll be able to find your username and your password in the log files. That being said, they'll probably just be able to grab your hashes and try and crack them anyway if they've compromised the server. Never modify data with get, as it can be replayed without warning as well. So there are some uses for the get method. This could probably be considered a vulnerability if you're sending sensitive data, but it is actually really helpful if you're not sending sensitive data in certain scenarios. So parameters can be bookmarked and sent again when visiting the bookmark. So a site like Rightmove or a housing website might want you to be able to put filters in and easily bookmark your pages. So to do this, they use the get method, as it can be replayed and it can be bookmarked. There are some limitations on the get method. You can only send a maximum of 2048 characters in the URL. So, I mean, it would be a bit crazy sending a whole blog post through. It would look insane in your URL as well. Only accept ASCII characters, and again, parameters are bookmarked. This can be seen as a limitation or a security vulnerability. This can be seen as a security vulnerability or a bit of functionality, depending on the type of data that you're sending. Post method. So the post method sends data in the body of the request, which means that it is secure. It cannot be logged on the server side. It isn't, shown in the URL. It can't be seen in browser history. And if you resubmit data, the browser will typically warn the user. Any type of data can be sent in a post request, and post requests are typically used for handling any sensitive data like logging into the application. So there's no character limit in a post request, which means that you can send any files that you want. Requests are not cached unless they're specified to be cached with a cache control header, and as I said, it can be used for sending files. Parameters are not bookmarkable, so this can either be seen as a good thing or a bad thing, similar to GET requests, but kind of on the flip side. If you're wanting people to be able to bookmark filters and variables to your site, then post requests are not the correct way to do it. If you're wanting to send sensitive data or files, post requests are the correct way to do it. The put method. So the put method is used for uploading files directly to a web server. Attempting to use the put method in a web application will typically return you a 405 response code. We'll go into a bit more information about what what response codes in general are a little bit later on in this tutorial. So it's possible to upload files via the put method. So if this is left unrestricted on an application, it's fairly trivial to upload, reverse shells and try and get access to the underlying server. The delete method. This is fairly self-explanatory. It's used to delete files from the server. If this is left unrestricted, you can pretty much delete any files from a web application. Options method is used to ask the web server what methods the client can use. So you're basically saying, hey web server, what will you allow me to use? This will often come back saying you can use put and delete and all sorts, but it's typically a false positive. It's always worth checking to see if this is actually true or not if you do get this as a response. But remember, you can't just start uploading things and deleting things from some random person's server, so proceed with caution. Trace method, this performs a loop back. It's not really that important to go into for now. It's mainly used for debugging, but it will essentially echo the request back to you. If this is enabled, you might be able to perform a type of attack called cross-site tracing. Patch method, similar to the put method, allows you to upload files to the server, but it allows you to modify or overwrite a specific resource as opposed to just uploading another file. Unrestricted patch method could allow overwriting of sensitive files and obviously uploading of malware or reverse shells or something to the web server itself. So we've taken a look at methods, and we understand that methods are basically an instruction or an action that we are sending to the server. This is the beginning of the request. We're saying, hey, we've got a load more data coming after this, but this is how you're supposed to handle the data. So we'll take a look at the resource. Web applications are essentially just files and folders that are stored on a server. So in the screenshot below, you can see that got a folder structure called var.dub.html images, and within images we have smileyface.jpg. If we are browsing to application.com/images/smileyface.jpg, all we're doing is browsing to the images folder within their web root and accessing smileyface.jpg file. The web server is then sending it back, and it's then rendered in the client, as we discussed at the beginning. HTTP version. So HTTP has 4 versions currently. 0.9 is never really used anymore. I'd be surprised if you saw it. HTTP 1.0 is old, but it is still used sometimes, so you might come across it. HTTP 1.1 is the most commonly used version today, and it probably will remain that way for the foreseeable future. HTTP 2.0 is in use at the moment, but it's not very popular, and it will be used a lot more in the future. Little bit off topic, but HTTP 2.0 has introduced multiplexing, which essentially allows you to grab multiple resources at the same time. So you'll be able to grab, your style.css and your scripts.js at the same time for faster loading pages. It's pretty cool if you ask me. So we'll take a look at the host header, which is a really interesting header. This has been designed to approach a problem whereby web developers want to be able to have multiple applications on the same server. So the host header is introduced. If you are trying to access a web application by its IP address, and a web server by its IP address, and there are 2 applications stored on there, and you change the host header to application A or application B, this will determine what you're actually going to see, what website is rendered to you. So as you can imagine, this is really powerful because it allows you to have as many websites as you want actually hosted on your server. That being said, I wouldn't recommend having too many hosted on there, because if you compromise the underlying server and you have 200 websites on there, that's 200 websites that potentially can become compromised. So the user agent is used to define what it defines your host information. So it talks a little bit about what client you're using and what PC and operating system you're using as well. Changing your user agent to a mobile client would often change your view slightly or change the page around. This is because developers obviously want to have custom pages created for viewing on a mobile or viewing on a PC, because it looks different. It's all down to this kind of user experience. So this is how it actually realizes if you're on a mobile or if you're on a computer. Content type is a header that is used to indicate the media type of a resource. So unrecognized content type should always be researched. If you're ever on a pen test or doing a bug bounty or something, and you see a content type that you don't recognize, research it, because it will have vulnerabilities that are associated to it, or it might even have vulnerabilities that you can't really perform. So application JSON, for example, is a very popular content type amongst APIs, and it's quite difficult to execute your standard flavors of cross-site requests for during cross-site scripting with an application JSON. Content type, not impossible, but fairly difficult, whereas a text HTML content type makes it fairly trivial to execute really, really easy attacks, like cross-site scripting or whatever. Headers, so there are quite a few different headers that can be sent in a request, but we're just going to touch on a few of them for now. So the cache control header controls how your pages are cached or stored in your browser. So client-side caching is a sort of an attack whereby you can log out of an application, press the back button a load of times, and see sensitive information on authenticated pages, because you're not actually sending a request to the server, you're just viewing the cache from the browser. The forwarded header, this can have quite a few different attributes. It can be X forwarded for, X forwarded by, or whatever, but basically discloses original information of the client when connecting to a web server through a HTTP proxy. Authorization header is used for things like basic authorization, or with APIs you might put a bearer token or some kind of authorization token in this header. It's obviously a really important header, especially for APIs. Content encoding, so the type of encoding that's being used. So HTTPS compression, for example, has an attack that's related to it called breach, which is a sort of theoretical attack where you can send a lot of requests and potentially get a bit of unencrypted data back, but it is very theoretical, I believe, or very difficult to perform anyway. You can usually tell if this is true by the application showing gzip deflate. There are lots more headers. You should definitely have a look into headers yourself, and when you're doing penetration tests or bug bounties or anything, you should research all of the headers that you see within your requests and responses. The referrer header is a spelling mistake. It's quite amusing to me, but this is basically telling the server where you've come from. So now we know that HTTP uses a request, it has a complete anatomy of the request, it uses the methods to actually tell the server what to do, it tells it what content type it wants, it tells it what application version. Now HTTP responses are very similar in terms of what they're actually made out of, apart from the HTTP response code and obviously the data that's returned. So HTTP responses are probably the most important part of it for the purposes of this tutorial. So here's the anatomy of a HTTP response. As you can see, the version, content type, cache control and headers are still there. They're still the same. They're in a different order, but then we've got this new bit, which is the response code. So here's what the HTTP response looks like in a real response. So we've got the response code, the version, the content type, and the cache control. Definitely recognize this from the requests. They look very similar. Obviously the data will be completely different depending on what application you're using, but you can't see that for the time being because we are just looking at a GET request. So HTTP response codes are broken into different categories. So 100s are informational, so if it returns 101 or 100 code, it means that the request's been received and it's still processing. 200 responses means that the action was received, understood or accepted, so 200 are good response codes. They usually mean that something's happened and it's been positive and it's been done successfully. 300s are redirection codes. 400s are client errors, so you know your 404 means the client's requested a resource that doesn't exist, and 500s are internal server errors. So this is basically the server telling you what's happened when it's sending your request back. Has it been able to process it? Has it successfully been able to do it? Thanks guys for listening to this video, and subscribe for more content or feel free to follow me on Twitter. Thank you for listening, and I hope you've enjoyed this tutorial on what is HTTP. Don't forget to subscribe to the Hack to the Basics channel for more video tutorials.